Good afternoon and welcome back to the second set of papers this afternoon. And just a quick announcement for those who are online. There's been a slight schedule change in that Professor MacDonald and Professor Berg have swapped places. So we will be hearing Professor David MacDonald up next, and Professor Maxine Berg will present tomorrow. Also like to welcome Professor Sven Beckert, who has newly arrived in the room, and also, again, those who are joining us online. Well, it gives me great pleasure to welcome David MacDonald from the University of Guelph and its, I guess, unofficial satellite campus in New Zealand. And David MacDonald is a mixed-race political science professor from Treaty 4 lands in Regina. He comes from Trinidad Indian and Scottish ancestry. He was appointed in 2017 as Research Leadership Chair for the College of Social and Human Sciences at Guelph. He's a full professor there, and he's the North American series editor for Global Political Sociology at Palgrave Macmillan. He's held faculty positions at the University of Otago in New Zealand, which is a partner with Queen's University and the Matariki network of universities, and also at the École Supérieure de Commerce de Paris, and he has a PhD in International Relations from the LSE. His work focuses on comparative Indigenous politics in Canada, in, I'm hoping pronouncing this rightly, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the United States. And he's worked extensively in IR, in American foreign policy, Holocaust and genocide studies, and critical race theory. He's recently completed another project which he's the principal investigator, Binationalism as a Form of Aboriginal Settler Reconciliation in a Multicultural Context. What can Canada learn from New Zealand's model of power sharing, funded by the SSHRC, and he's active on two other SHIRK, as we call it here in Canada, grants. He's published 4 sole-authored books and numerous edited books, journal special issues, etc., and published in Canadian Journal of Political Science, Journal of Genocide Research, and others. And I won't read the whole list, but his most recent book is, I think, Comparative Politics, Integrating Theories, Methods, and Cases, co-authored with T. Dickovic and J. Eastwood, OUP Canada. Actually, it says in press 2020.
Oh no, that's been published.
CV? Yeah, that's an old CV.
So that would be a bit of an old CV. Yeah, but
anyway, so please welcome Professor MacDonald for this talk.
Thanks very much. Marnie. Wait a sec here. Hang on. Marnie covered this already, but just to acknowledge the territory that we're on the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, and also home to a significant Métis community as well. So I just wanted to mention that before I go on. Also, if those of you who read the paper will know that there's talk of genocide, there's talk of genocide denial and atrocities and many things like that. So I put, one of my Indigenous colleagues in Saskatchewan had gone to a talk on denialism and was quite triggered by some of the content. So I thought I'd preempt that in case there are any survivors or their families in the room by putting up just a bit of a warning about some of the material that I will allude to here, but is certainly covered in more detail in the paper. If you don't have a copy of the paper and you want one, I'm certainly happy to send it to you. It's a pretty rough piece of work and it's very long, so please bear that in mind as we go through. I just want to thank a few people, obviously, Daniel, Amitava, and Heather. Thank you very much for organizing this conference and inviting me here, as well as my university as well. I'm on sabbatical at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and I'm a fellow at the New Zealand Centre for Indigenous Peoples in the Law, so they've been very helpful with my work as well. SHIRK has also continuously funded me since 2008, so they've been extremely nice to me. I have a research partner, Cheryl Lightfoot, who's an Anishinaabe scholar and the outgoing chair of the MRIP, so she does a lot of UN work. So we do a lot of research together with a range of Indigenous collaborators in different parts of the world. I also previously worked for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and I've had involvement with the Royal Commission on Abuse and Care in New Zealand, and also the Office of the Special Interlocutor here in Canada. So these are just some of the different parties I've been involved with in some of their works. I'm a political scientist, but I'm also, in a sense, a bit of a practitioner of some of the issues that I look at in my work as well. So yeah, Daniel's mentioned that I'm from Regina. That's my mom. My mom's family were all originally indentured laborers that were brought out in 1856 onwards, and that's their shipping record there. They were brought out to Trinidad as indentured laborers and spent a good chunk of their lives cutting sugar cane on three sugar plantations in the south of Trinidad. The reason I'm putting my mom up in this picture is because part of my work relates to newcomers to Canada, because when my mom came here in 1964, there was a strong sense that it was essentially a white country. But if you sort of kept your head down and slotted into the established racial, social, political, and economic hierarchy, you could do pretty well. In Regina at that time, Indigenous peoples were very much at the bottom. And as she had internalized her own sense of racial hierarchy in place within the system, she also had a particular sense of where Indigenous peoples should fit in as well. And that was somewhat below her, whereas whiter skinned people were above. And this was something that I think the missionaries had inculcated pretty well in the case of my mom and her schooling in Trinidad. As the TRC process developed, really from the 1980s through the United Church, with which she was quite heavily involved, she began to, I think, really question a lot of the norms and the kind of the foundational ideas she had about racial hierarchies, certainly in Western Canada. And the idea that white people might do bad things and that we could actually talk about them was somewhat of a revelation to my mom in her 60s. And so she kind of fueled, in a sense, some of my interest in looking at truth and reconciliation, particularly for non-white, non-Indigenous newcomers to Canada. The question of what do we want people to understand and learn about when people come here? Do we want them to slot into an existing racial, economic, political, and cultural order? Or do we want them to understand that there's movement and change and that things can be questioned? Potentially for the better. So these are just some of the things that I've looked at in my work. Some of the paper as well is kind of a reaction to this idea of the Great Awakening that has developed. There's a lot of literature which is very critical of settler colonial studies, which is critical of saying that genocide occurred in the residential schools or that land was stolen from Indigenous peoples. There's a large body of literature that's kind of saying that colonialism was a good idea, particularly British colonialism, which we could potentially talk about later. And so for me, the issue of genocide became very important early on in my writing. And we're now in a situation where it's been officially recognized. So that's something I'll talk about later as well. And I've kind of dealt with the third item there. So the outline of the paper is 4 sections. First, look at different stereotypes and myths as foundational to the Canadian settler state, which I argue create certain kind of pull factors. They kind of demonstrate a region which is almost like a vacuum, that there's room for people, settlers of European origin, to come in. They'll be welcomed. There's also a sense of historical inevitability, that Indigenous peoples were thinly spread out. There weren't many of them to begin with. They had no borders and boundaries, no governments to speak of, no states, no nations. And so as settlers, they or we would inherit the good stuff as Indigenous cultures and societies eventually died off. The second part of the paper looks at Indigenous rights as being sui generis and not based on on the victimization of Indigenous peoples. I think there's a tendency to think that if we talk about Indigenous genocide, then that gives a sort of a right of cessation based on being victims. And the argument that I would make is that we have to be careful not to engage in what Eve Tuck has called a depravity narrative, that it's important that Indigenous narratives of self-determination and self-governance since time immemorial should essentially dictate what the reconciliation process should look like. It shouldn't be based on articulating different ideas of victimization as the main reason why Indigenous people should be able to self-determine on their own land with their own autonomous governments and things like that. The third part of the paper then looks at the slow evolution of genocide discussion and eventually recognition in Canada. And then I looked at some issues of denialism and some questions about that. That might be the most contentious part of the paper in the sense that up until a few years ago, I used to have these fairly active debates with people who said it wasn't genocide. Probably the most prominent one was a review of my 2019 book in the Literary Review of Canada, where one side said it's genocide, the other side said it isn't genocide. So now I'm not sure if we can still have those kinds of debates. At a personal academic level, I think that they're interesting. At a collective level, they can potentially do harm to Indigenous peoples and communities. So that becomes an issue that we could discuss as well. Okay, what else have I got here? I talk a bit about history wars in the paper, which we can get into, which I would briefly define as being debates over collective memory within a national territory between those separated by generational, ethnic, ideological, or other divisions deemed to be of fundamental importance to members of the groups involved. And I also highlight that sometimes catalytic events like a 150th anniversary of Confederation or something like that can, or the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas can touch off some of these debates as key flashpoints. So the first part of the paper looks at a number of stereotypes. I've gone through a large number of older documents and kind of tried to isolate some key stereotypes which became important, especially in school textbooks to children. And I have a short section that looks at why stereotypes are helpful in some psychological way as being cognitive shortcuts. I have some stuff about schematic thinking as well. So the stereotypes, again, are all in the paper, but I look first at the myth of meritocracy, the myth of the idea of Turtle Island or North America as being empty land with few people, small governments or no governments, no concept of statehood, and then a kind of a stadial theory idea with Indigenous peoples being seen as living at a stone age of development. This goes into a variety of other stereotypes as well, including a lot of gender-biased stereotypes, which are particularly harmful and which the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls picked up on and examined in quite a bit of detail, which I thought was interesting. A number of other ones, too, look at the idea of Indigenous peoples as being childlike. Some of the material I looked at made that explicit case, and therefore in need of wardship or paternalism by the state. The sense of being a doomed race, which and then settlers get to inherit the good things such as the canoes or the maple syrup and that sort of thing become quite important to that kind of a mythology. A lot of these myths exist also in Australia, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There's kind of a global nature to much of this because the empire builders who developed systems moved around a lot. They were sometimes in India, they were in Africa, they were in southern Saskatchewan, they might be in the North Island of New Zealand. I mean, if you look at the trajectory of a lot of these people, it's quite amazing how they move around. And so there are a lot of commonalities between not just the stereotypes, but between actually the people that are promoting the stereotypes. And then at the other end, you do have a lot of Indigenous organizing, which is also designed to kind of stop some of these stereotypes from taking place. A lot of myths of alcoholism as well, and a great deal of literature still about an Indigenous predisposition to alcohol. most recently the publisher Conrad Black making stereotypical comments which were not unlike things that were mentioned in Department of Indian Affairs reports in 1904 and then earlier material from the 1850s. And then the role of missionaries also becoming quite important. The second kind of big theme I look at is that we have to be careful, I think, in looking at Indigenous rights literature in this damage-centered research, which Eve Tuck has talked about a great deal. That literature, as Vine Deloria Jr., the Standing Rock Sioux intellectual, says above, the critiques of the American state or the Canadian state are pre-American, as he puts it. They're not anti-American or anti-colonial. They existed before, they continued to exist. So part of what I'm trying to do in the paper is to say that the woke literature, the literature that is against this idea of wokeness or that there's some new thing that's developing and somehow enticing Indigenous peoples in Indigenous rights discourse, actually predates the civil rights movement by a long degree, and doesn't necessarily go along with a lot of the civil rights material that was taking place in the 1950s and 60s. Vine Deloria, in fact, pokes fun at some civil rights elements in some of his work, which I think is kind of interesting. So the paper then looks at like Desgaje's famous address to the League of Nations in 1923, 1924. Ratana, who founded the Ratana Church in Aotearoa, New Zealand, who's a well-known Maori figure, goes also to the League of Nations as well during around the same time. And I sort of get into some of the Indigenous rights narratives and discourse, which in some ways are quite distinct from some of the other material that I look at in the piece. I'm going over a huge amount of material, and so hopefully it's comprehensible. If you've read the paper, you'll know it's incredibly long, and I need to shorten it down, but I'm happy to elaborate on any of these themes as we go along. A lot of the work that I've done, the previous book I did in 2019, which is called The Sleeping Giant Awakens, looks at the development of a genocide consciousness and the quest for some recognition of genocide having occurred in Canada. The earliest Indigenous discussion of genocide is interpreted through the Genocide Convention and the UN Genocide Convention. Goes back to 1959. Reaches a short sort of peak during the Trudeau White Paper era of 1969. Then through the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which kind of opens up discussion of genocide at that time. And then during the period of the TRC, it really gets off the ground quite a bit more than that. And then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015, of course, makes a conclusion of cultural genocide, which becomes very important in terms of how we want to understand truth and reconciliation in the country. We also have the removing of statues, the changing of names of schools, and of course Ryerson University becomes Toronto Metropolitan University. A lot of things change. Heads like John A. MacDonald's head tend to roll, and my understanding too is that the statue of the first Prime Minister is, I still think, stored away somewhere in Kingston. I'm not sure where that is at the moment. Genocide then becomes an important aspect of national discussion with the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, where they identify a race-based genocide of Indigenous peoples. They also develop a separate sociological definition, which is also based on international law. And that's all accepted by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Then we have the unmarked burials in Kamloops in 2021, and then two genocide recognition bills, the second of which in October of 2022 goes through. And so Canada, the House of Commons, officially recognizes that the state committed genocide against Indigenous peoples, which follows admissions by the Prime Minister early on that the state is continuing an ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples. So it's a very interesting and quite unique kind of set of admissions from the Prime Minister and the government. What follows on from there is the Office of the Independent Special Interlocutor, who's Kim Murray, as you can see up there, and she's it's her. This is ongoing until December, and so they're trying to locate a lot of the sites of the missing burials, but also to very much kind of create a narrative that around the issue of genocide, and then also to combat genocide denial, which is an important part of what the special interlocutor is trying to do. And then I think this is the last slide here, if I'm not mistaken. The last part of the paper then goes into these issues of genocide denial and what they mean. A few years ago, it was improbable to me that the state would recognize genocide against Indigenous peoples. It seemed to be more of an academic debate that I seem to be having with a lot of people, often historians, and not something that was generally broadly accepted, although public opinion polls indicated that a rough majority of Canadian respondents did believe that genocide had taken place, or cultural genocide had taken place. We're now in a situation where genocide has been recognized statistically, and using polls, the majority of Canadians believe that to be so. They don't necessarily believe that they, as individual Canadians, have responsibility for doing anything about it. It seems like more it would be something for the state to sort out. So the last part of the paper looks at some of this denialist literature, which does tend to circle back and reproduce many of the kinds of stereotypes that I identify in the first part of the paper from about the 1850s onwards. So the base of a lot of the, I guess if you want to call it genocide denial, which you could do, is based on kind of regurgitating all of these older stereotypes, which I think still have are strongly foundational in the way that Canada understands itself. So I try to unpack some of those to a certain extent. I don't really offer much of a critique of them in the paper, but that's probably something that I'll do later. So like some of the other papers that we've seen so far, this is a work in progress. It's a rough draft. It's got probably 4 sections which could potentially stand on their own. And they're kind of woven together because I think they fit together. But bits of them will probably end up being separate publications in time. So anyway, I've talked a little bit longer than I should have done, but hopefully I haven't spoken too quickly and it makes sense. And we certainly have a lot of time for me to answer questions if there's anything you don't agree with or you'd like me to clarify, or some comments or observations that you'd like to make, then that would be great. Okay, so thank you very much.
David, thank you so much for the paper and acknowledgement. As I said before, Tasmania was one of the first places named in the Genocide Act in the UN. We have a long way to go to come back. I want to ask you, the kind of anti-woke, critical race theory, all of that going on. I wonder if you can comment on the kind of relations between First Nations peoples and non-First Nations peoples who are allies. So Claire Land in Decolonising Solidarity says, you know, even when you're working for us, it's always about you. So with the question of the approach around the denial, whether it is, again, people saying, making it about themselves, like the voice went down, not only because some people didn't believe sovereignty was ceded, but because Aboriginal people were positioned as, you know, becoming a special interest group that would be above everybody else, and everybody else would miss out. So it became about us when it really wasn't about us. So I wonder if you can comment on the relation between non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people who are allies, as well as the ones who are not allies.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for that. I guess I could answer it in a few different ways. I mean, one of the things I've looked at quite a bit here is are tropes of multiculturalism. So the idea that the state is a multicultural state. And this is where my own Trinidad family comes into it too, because we're sort of, Canada is supposed to be a diverse country, and Indigenous peoples can kind of slot in as one of the diverse elements of the country. So if you fly into Pearson Airport, there's lots of little kids of different colors waving with different languages, and the Indigenous kids are there too, but you kind of get the sense that, they are one of many groups. And so legally that's not the case, but I think normatively in the way that diversity is expressed in Canada, that does become the case. And so you do get a sense where Indigenous rights, which are treaty rights, which are sui generis rights, are seen by some people to be unfair because because not everybody else can access them, and other people have been victims of racism and sexism and that sort of thing, but they're not Indigenous, so they don't have that kind of recognition. And so you do see kind of a level of misunderstanding and maybe resent based on that. In terms of, I suppose, white allies and that sort of thing, I think people are sometimes in it for themselves. I think there is a problem, and I think this is true in Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand as well, of kind of white gatekeepers or other gatekeepers who will presume to kind of police their own fellow white people and tell them what is acceptable or not, and that can lead to kind of resent. It can also lead to charges of virtue signaling. A lot of the anti-woke stuff, I guess, and I'm thinking of a recent book by Adam Kirshner, which just came out this year, where he's basically really mad at land acknowledgements and other white people in universities signaling virtue, but not necessarily wanting to change anything. So it's kind of those that don't like wokeness seem to not like white hypocritical liberals, and and then it does kind of raise the question: well, what do Indigenous peoples have to do with much of this? And the answer is sometimes not much, because it's kind of it's a white talking shop sometimes. So I don't know if that resonates with your experiences in Australia, but that's what I'm seeing in Canada and Aotearoa New Zealand, to a certain extent in the U.S. Yeah.
John McNeil.
Oh, I think.
So, David, I apologize for the fact that I didn't read your paper. I thought it was going to be tomorrow, and I only try to stay about a few hours ahead.
Total respect. Yeah.
And sometimes fail even at that. So this may be dealt with in the paper, but
yeah.
Could you summarize the key differences in the way debates surrounding genocide and denialism of genocide have unfolded in Canada on the one hand and Aotearoa New Zealand on the other hand?
Okay. Well, they haven't unfolded much in New Zealand. There's 3 articles that have been full-length academic articles written on genocide in New Zealand, and I've written 2 of them. So it's actually a very small. It's a very small market. Here, I mean, it developed over a longer period of time. I think it was influenced probably quite a bit by the United States as well. The Red Power movement, around which Vine Deloria helped found in the 1960s, did talk about genocide and cultural genocide. If you look at material from here around the same time, it's also talking about genocide. People like David Stannard and Ward Churchill in 1992 and so on talk about an American Holocaust and talk about genocide. And then that gets picked up by different people who are submitting for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, like Chris John Young's book, The Circle Game, which basically uses similar kinds of analysis. So it kind of develops like that. The reason why genocide, why there's space for it to be looked at here, is because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was based solely to look at Indigenous experiences and Indigenous peoples. And because the money for that, the $60 million initial seed money, came from the settlement agreement, which was put up by survivors, this was something that they wanted to look at. And of course, because the mandate that was supposed to be post-judicial, they couldn't find genocide. But when I interviewed Murray Sinclair, he said he had wanted to tell the lawyers and put in the final report that it was genocide, and his lawyers said no. And I actually wrote a report for the TRC, which they commissioned, that looked at how you could apply the Genocide Convention to the experiences, but they couldn't do it for the mandate. So when Kim Murray, who is the executive director of the TRC, became the special interlocutor. The recent reports she's put out, the most recent was in June of this year, basically says that TRC provided all the evidence needed to say that it was genocide in Canada. And she sort of sees their report of June this year as kind of a capstone, essentially, saying that that the TRC found genocide, and the special interlocutor's office has confirmed that. So that's kind of how things have evolved here in Canada, or in New Zealand. I was involved with the Royal Commission on Abuse and Care, and I was part of a group that had a memorandum of understanding with them. So we got to go to a lot of the meetings with the commissioners and the staff. The thing with that one was that while 80% of those abused in care and taken from their families were Indigenous Maori, and a large proportion were also Pacifica people, because you had other groups, there was a tendency to dilute the experiences. So the question of genocide, which might have applied to Indigenous peoples, and specifically they were taken away from their hapu and iwi, or their tribal and family entities, and because of that, they were put into closed adoption, so they lost their ties to land, and they lost essentially their access to being members of the political entities intergenerationally, who were parties to the Treaty of Waitangi, which is the founding document of Aotearoa New Zealand. So that commission, because of the 20% who weren't Maori, was not under its mandate able to start singling out different groups for being, victims of specific violations of international law. And there's some provisions of the New Zealand Inquiries Act, I think of 2013, which make it difficult to find any breaches of law in the way that royal commissions function. So I don't know if that answers your question, and it might be a bit too legalistic, but does it kind of touches on some of?
Yes, it does. But is there something in New Zealand society that's particularly resistant compared to Canada?
Well, there's there is a very strong backlash against Maori rights. There is that sense that, and Maori are a larger proportion of the population, so about 16%. They're guaranteed seats in Parliament for Maori. To the foreign minister is Maori. There's it's an official language, but there's a hardcore group of white New Zealanders who really don't want Maori to have this, the kinds of political power or whatever that they do. So they're very resistant to it. And so there's a lot of pushback. And you don't have to scratch hard to find quite a bit of pretty embedded racism in New Zealand. So that's part of the thing. It's also the case too, to a certain extent, that, I did quite a bit of work with Bernie Farber and Michael Dan here, looking at genocide recognition. Bernie Farber is a son of a Holocaust survivor, and he and Michael Dan and Phil Fontaine, who is the former National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, wrote a well-known article a number of years ago in which they called out the Canadian government for genocide. And so in a sense, I suppose the Jewish community in Canada has been much more supportive of seeing it as genocide, but also in having the nuance to say, it's not like the Holocaust, doesn't have to be, it's just, the convention applies, but we're not going to go comparing it to what Hitler did. And those levels of nuance, I think, are useful. In the case of Australia as well, there was a certain permission structure is there, and I'm thinking of Colin Tatz and others, and probably Robert Mann too. I think others, different Jewish Australians. Tony Barta, who's a friend of mine, son of Holocaust survivors. They all, were happy to kind of stand with Aboriginal peoples and say, yeah, this looks like genocide to me. No, it's not the Holocaust, but it looks like genocide. And I remember Tony telling me a story of how he had Auschwitz survivors coming to him and showing them their numbers and saying, well, it can't be genocide because it's not like Auschwitz. And he said, well, that's not what I'm saying. But in the New Zealand case, there hasn't been, it's been different in that sense. I think too, partly because Maori have always been a larger proportion of the population. So the level of marginalization has probably been a bit less in some ways. So that would be some of the reasons. But yeah, it's a lot of complicated factors involved with that. Yeah. So maybe that answers your question. I'm not sure. Maxine.
Heidi Turek.
Oh,
Can you hear it?
Okay, I'm just going to read Heidi's question. She said, thanks, David, for this important paper. Several times, deniers have emailed the entire UBC history department about residential schools, so to emphasize how real this problem is. So 2 questions. 1, how far do you describe a British imperial situation rather than a global one? Are there similarities or differences with Latin America or East Asia, for example? And her second question is, might looking at booklets for citizenship exams be interesting to see how Indigenous peoples and national histories are represented and how that has changed over time?
okay. Well, thanks very much. I think I understood the questions. I guess I would say I don't. My focus really is on the British Empire. I don't really want to comment too much on comparatively in other cases. I think it's something that the former imperial system is grappling with in different ways. I'm good in French, but not in Spanish or Portuguese, so I don't presume to know a lot of those debates, and I'd have to pass on making overt comparisons on a level of ignorance. As for the second thing, I think it was relating to the citizenship test and the citizenship guide. I've done a couple of publications saying how horrendous the citizenship guide is. The original one was from 2012. I think Jason Kenney was the immigration minister at that time. The Liberals ran on a platform of changing the immigration guide. It's still the same damn guide. Like, it hasn't changed. Like, I actually downloaded it last week, and I think it still had the imprint of 2012, and it had the Queen on it. So the citizenship, like, that's like 12 years later, right? And nothing has been done that I can see. And it's still the stereotypes. Indigenous peoples came from Asia long ago, and then they helped out the Europeans, but and the maple leaf and everything are all like symbols from Europe. Like, it's you can kind of go through the different stereotypes that one would think, and a lot of them are still in the guide. So it's kind of weird. I suppose there's some bureaucratic reasons why it hasn't been updated. I think there's probably some revised drafts and frustrated people floating around who want to change it, but it hasn't stuck hold yet. So, okay.
Maxine Berg.
Maxine, and then.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your paper. I don't know a lot about the current politics, but I'm really interested in this concept of the settler and how that relates to the, I think, deeply embedded conceptualizations of the stages of human progress set out in the Enlightenment, from hunter-gatherers on to pastoralists and on to cultivators. And so those settlers are always conceived to be cultivators, and they are at a more advanced stage than what the Indigenous peoples of Canada and America were perceived as, which is just hunter-gatherers and just.
Yeah.
But I don't know, these stages and the boundaries between them, they are a little complex. And I just want to ask about discussions that have been going on in these debates about maritime rights. Because, I've been doing quite a lot of work on British Columbia and late 18th century British Columbia, and the big issue there is deeply embedded property rights in the sea and the shorelines among different Indigenous groups. That was recognized. Those were actually written about by Cook and the other account writers that came after in the the following few decades.
Hmm.
And I would be really interested to see how those issues have come up in these debates over rights.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I don't know too much about. So you're kind of asking, like I guess you have like Tom Flanagan in First Nations Second Thoughts, and who makes the kind of argument about Indigenous peoples being at a Stone Age level and being nomadic and therefore not having essentially property rights, which I think is one of the arguments that he makes. When it comes to maritime boundaries, I'm struggling to recall if he does say anything about that. I think one of the arguments he makes is that like he basically says that First Nations only become nations in terms of a label after Quebec wants to secede from Canada, and therefore, but he would deny them the status of nations because they don't behave like European nations. But I think there's a presumption that nations have a right to territory and maybe sea boundaries in a way that what he perceives to be nomadic Indigenous groups would not. So I suppose that's kind of maybe the argument he would make. I'm not sure. In the case of Aotearoa in New Zealand, there's a big controversy now because there's what's called the foreshore and seabed debate, because much of the coastal areas they're all controlled by different Maori, Hapu and Iwi. And then there was a big controversy about how much of the foreshore and seabed was owned by Maori. I believe 40% of the fishing quota is now owned by different Maori iwi in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So there has been some recognition through the treaty settlement process of that reality. To what extent that's the case here, I'm not sure, but probably a lot less. But I suppose if you're going through these different rhetorical hoops as does Flanagan, then you would say that if they're not nations in a European way, then they don't have the right to make claims that a European nation would make, and that prior use and prior occupancy do not constitute ownership, I guess would be the argument. But I'd have to go back and look at all these different things. But that would be kind of the gist of what he would probably argue. Which, obviously I don't agree with. Yeah, so, and I think you had a question there, or somebody else?
Thank you for your talk.
Okay, whatever order you like, yeah.
Yeah.
Hello.
Okay, is it understandable?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I'll add you to the
my
list.
name is Vananel. I'm a visitor to Queens in this term from Germany. And I would like to ask you a question that catches up a little bit what you mentioned before. Do you think that the concept that has been developed by Michael Rothberg on the multidirectional memory could help in the situation coming out of the race of who suffered the most out of the confrontation between the different groups who suffered?
Yes, thank you for the question. I have used Michael Rothberg's work, sort of the competitive memory versus multidimensional memory. I've done a couple pieces in the Journal of Genocide Research in which I used that concept. And I think the competitive memory era was probably in the 1990s with David Stannard, with Ward Churchill and others. And you get to a more multi-directional form of memory later on because if you look at there's a genocide report from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in 2019. And they explicitly say genocide in Canada did not follow the Holocaust prototype. It is not like the Holocaust. And the TRC as well, they had Robbie Weisman was a Holocaust survivor who was part of their advice. He was an honorary witness. And he was quoted in the report too, saying various things like that as well. So the TRC and the National Inquiry were very, very careful to kind of use, I guess, what you'd call a multi-directional memory form, saying we're not in competition with other groups of people who are victims of genocide. We might build bridges of understanding to them. They also had Eloge Butera, who is a Rwandan genocide survivor who spoke a lot at TRC national events. And they didn't necessarily directly make comparisons between their experiences and what happened to survivors in Canada, but they did kind of build bridges of empathy. So there wasn't even I wouldn't even say there was a lot of direct comparison, but there was this idea of multi-directionality. And maybe I'll chat with you later. I'm doing a piece for a book by Claudia Bruns. I don't know if you know her, but she's doing some stuff looking at some of these debates. And then Michael Rothberg also has this whole implicated subject thing, which my graduate students are all excited about now too. So that seems to be also making the rounds. Yeah.
So I'm going to just go over the speakers list now, which is getting long, and we have about 13 minutes left, endeavoring to stay on time this afternoon. So I have, first up will be Ksenia Pavoyska, followed by Heather Salter, then online Samuel Svigdai, and Virginia Julie, followed by Julia McClure here in the room. So Ksenia.
Thank you, David. I'm hoping that since you are our political scientist, that contemporary politics are fair game.
Yep. Sure.
So my question, I haven't read the June report, which makes the genocide claim more explicit, but building off the past couple questions, I'm wondering about international legal human rights frameworks and what, if any, discourse there is in Canadian politics right now about the relationship between genocide in Canada and claims of genocide in Palestine, and whether there are, how the kind of solidarity between groups is affecting the efforts at reconciliation in Canada, or whether there are any negative impacts on Indigenous populations in Canada for building bridges of empathy or echoing similarities to Palestinians.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean that's a super loaded question, and that it's a very big question too. I think I don't want to speak for Indigenous peoples, but I mean a lot of Indigenous friends, colleagues, collaborators, some of them elders, are extremely pro-Palestinian and have been working very hard for Palestinian rights. And I'd referred to that book by Adam Kirshner on settler colonialism, and he takes particular aim at the fact that Israel is seen as a settler colony, and so is the United States. And so there is kind of that book is an example of how there becomes a backlash against the Palestinians, but also against Native Americans in order to protect a particular concept of Zionism. And so there is, in a sense, a backlash. And then he takes down every aspect of settler colonial studies. He goes to Patrick Wolf and Lorenzo Veracini and everybody else, and he's just like, no. And the basis of his critique basically is that since Israel isn't a settler colony, but he also kind of says the U.S. and Australia aren't either. He's got some really weird definition of it. I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain, but I don't know if there's a backlash against Indigenous peoples because of the situation in Gaza, Palestine. But I think the kind of some aspects of the Indigenous rights movement have moved to that as a main focus for the moment. But I think it is also allowing those on the right to see those in favor of Palestinian rights and those in favor of Indigenous rights as being part of a kind of homogenous awakening. And then that being able to say there is such a thing is in a rhetorical way is also to suggest that, I don't know, whatever, Western civilization is under attack or something like that. So there's ways that peoples and groups and movements and ideas and different forms of resistance are being kind of lumped together and labeled and then kind of blanketly attacked. So it's kind of hard to know what is the fallout amongst the individual specific groups from that. But I find it a fairly negative phase of time that we're living through in terms of this anti-wokeness thing. And I don't know how long it'll last. We'll see. I think it'll probably, but it's certainly, there are people who are uncomfortable. Probably a lot of white Canadians and New Zealanders and Australians with the idea that their parents and grandparents, just by virtue of being who they were somehow responsible for genocide. And I know when I did some of the early columns and stuff I did in the newspaper and different things, I'd get a lot of letters and stuff from people saying, you know, my grandfather fought in the war. He didn't fight in the war to so white people could commit genocide against indigenous peoples. And I was thinking, okay, well, you know, my grandfather was white and he also fought in the war. I don't, you know, but I mean, it doesn't. So I wouldn't make the argument for guilt, but I would make the argument for maybe some kind of Rothberg's implicated subject, like we're all implicated, and some people might be more responsible than others. But anyway, that's kind of a long-winded way of answering your question, but also that I don't really know. Like it's difficult, and I think that individual peoples and groups will have had different experiences, by you know within that whole range of stuff going on.
Professor Heather Salter.
Thank you for this really good paper. My question was somewhat similar to Heidi's question, and I know you don't want to answer, you know, I don't to do the comparison, but I'm wondering, since we're in a conference about global history,
Yeah.
do you think that doing this, you know, thinking about this comparatively or in terms of continuity, is this a worthy goal? Is this something that we should be thinking about in terms of people who do global history?
Yeah, I think so. I think there'd be a lot of scope for looking at it, but I think it's something that should be done collaboratively as well. What are these? There's these enormous new European grants which Canada is now eligible for. Are they Horizon grants, something like that? I'm not sure, but I think there's scope for people who are in different regions of the world who have expertise in these areas to form collaborative networks and for us to look at this stuff together. Because I wouldn't want to have to become an expert in something else. But I think that if we were to all meet together, we'd probably see some interesting commonalities and be able to compare notes. So I think, yeah, it would be a fruitful development in the field for sure. You know, provided that there is a good number of people doing this kind of work, which I presume there would be, and maybe you know some of those people too. Maybe you are one of those people. No, okay. Okay.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, you've been very patient. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for the interesting, if a little heavy, subject. I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Number one is, I'm curious about the qualification cultural genocide. Why cultural? Is it to make a demarcation from other forms of genocide? I would like you to talk more about that.
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is, do you think the resistance against labeling what happened to indigenous population here in Canada as a genocide is a function of considering the Holocaust as paradigmatic example of genocide, and there is like a comparison of other atrocities against this, and the consideration of genocide as this one moment exterminatory act of massive killing? Whereas in Africa, say in Namibia or Congo, millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people were killed through a long process, through a long imperial process of making life unbearable or making life difficult for millions of people. So my question is again, do you think the resistance against the labeling of what happened to indigenous people here as a genocide is a function of considering the Holocaust as the paradigmatic example against which any other atrocities should be compared so that a determination can be made? Just the questions.
Yeah. Okay. If I think I understand that question, you're saying is the resistance to the concept of genocide here based on the idea that the Holocaust is considered the prototype of genocide, and therefore, if it's not like the Holocaust, it should be rejected, and if it's not like the Holocaust, it's an affront to Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and therefore should be rejected. Yeah, that's often stated, and I think those who have recognized it as genocide are making a very clear claim here that no, it's not like the Holocaust, and that's not the basis. Like my arguments have consistently been that it's a violation of 2E as the ground floor, which is the forcible transfer of children from one group to another group, and that's genocide. I mean, it happened in World War II as well, but you know, and then it's also it could be more than that, and we could make the argument that it is. But that's kind of the ground floor that I've been arguing for. Cultural genocide was defined by Raphael Lemkin, who created the term genocide in his book Axis, Rule in Occupied Europe, as a type of genocide. The 1947 draft UN Convention on genocide had cultural genocide had like a 4 or 5 point definition of cultural genocide as part of genocide, and it was considered as much genocide as killing people or preventing births within the group and that sort of thing. A lot of countries, including Canada, said that they didn't want it to be considered genocide. I think there are telegrams from Louis Saint Laurent saying, you know, we can't support this as a country if cultural genocide remains an element of the Genocide Convention. And France said that and there's a thing called the Travaux Préparatoires, which are this like a 5,000-page thing, which is all the deliberations on the convention. And they said that they couldn't have what they considered to be normal acts of statecraft criminalized as genocide in this international document. So on that basis, that whole section on cultural genocide disappeared. One element, which was 2E about forcibly transferring children, was tacked on to the definition of genocide, but the whole article was taken off. Why did the TRC consider that? Why did they make that determination? Because it wasn't a violation of international law. So the only reason, like, they couldn't make any finding of legal culpability on the part of the government. So they chose something which wasn't technically a criminal activity, and that's why they used the term. But as I said, Murray Sinclair was very clear that he thought it violated the Genocide Convention, but he wasn't allowed to say so, and he would say that publicly all the time. So as for Namibia and the Congo, I mean, what did Adam Hochschild say? About 10 or 12 million people killed in the Congo, something like that. I mean, I would certainly see that as genocide. Germany has recognized that it committed genocide in Namibia against the Ova, Herero, and Nama. So I think that has been recognized. To what extent they fully recognized it, and then there's some kind of, I mean, I think there's some cans of worms there with Germany that probably need to be opened up a lot more. I'd be pretty interested in exploring that further. But I think they have kind of recognized it. They haven't recognized it as being a nation foundational genocide, but I think it's been recognized. But so did that kind of answer your questions? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay, last two questions online to Virginia Julie.
Yeah, hi, Virginia. We're going to give you speaking privileges if you'd like to read your question out.
Does she have sound? Okay. I'm happy to go to the next one and then come back to her if she wants to.
Julie
Yeah.
McClure.
Thank you very much for this paper. So my question builds on the line of questioning established now by Heidi and Heather. Heidi Heather line of questioning. I'm really interested in this topic of Indigenous peoples in global history. I think they've often been missing from global history precisely because they've been associated with the hyperlocal and somehow absent from this framework of global history. And Heidi's question was, is this a national or imperial story? And you answered, well, it's kind of a British imperial story, but at the same time, you're talking about kind of post-1945 laws and institutions. So I was wondering whether you're seeing those post-1945 laws and institutions as a continuation of the British imperial story. Is that kind of how it's situated? And also, you do mention global a few times in the paper as a kind of form of oppression, the global colour line, global stereotypes against Indigenous peoples. But I was wondering if there's another kind of another way in which the framework of global history might be important also to the histories of indigenous peoples, which is that the relative importance of trans-regional solidarity between indigenous peoples and the alternative legal institutions such as the Indigenous Peoples Congress as a kind of form of globalizing resistance.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. That's something I don't look at very much in my own work, but which is not to say that since I'm 51, I could presumably look at it a lot more as I develop. And so maybe we can chat about that some more later. But I've mainly focused on the Kansas states and Sapmi. But I mean, that's partly because of the network of scholars that I work with who are mainly indigenous, and we kind of tend to focus on those settler states. And that's kind of how my networks have evolved in terms of making comparisons that make sense in a political science way. So I mean, I suppose in a political science context, like case study selection and a certain number of similarities of dependent and variables are important in terms and things. So things like British settlement and treaties or lack of treaties or things like that become important. Issues of the crown, all things like that become important to the way we would kind of assess what's going on. So it's, I guess the goal of a lot of what I do isn't really to have a global appreciation of colonialism or indigenous peoples and organizing, but to probably more specifically look at British settler colonial states or the Kansas states, which is probably a narrow focus in some ways, but it's kind of how the work has progressed. Yeah, and when I talk about, I guess, legacies of empire, I mean, I am looking at settler colonial states, where there are treaties or no treaties, where issues of the honor of the crown remains important, where there are still settler identities and settler institutions, where there are still Westminster parliaments, where the king is still head of state in some cases, where people were socialized with certain kinds of British norms, and very much remain so. And I think where a sense of the honor of the crown as the British crown remains for many indigenous peoples to be important. I mean, there's still this sense that settler state governments are usurpers, that the crown at various points was illegitimately divided. And so there's still a sense that Maori should go see King Charles when the New Zealand government is denying them their treaty rights, and I see that here too. So there is still a sense that the British Crown is an active instrument as part of the treaty process, which has a kind of a sacred dimension to it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I think there's a sense that there hasn't really been a break. Like there's not a sharp break from the past. Like what's the word of the Holocaust? Not Vernichtungsschlag. The Zivilisationsbruch. Was that Dan Diner? I think, yeah, like a rupture of civilization, which occurs after the end of something. I mean, there's no rupture. There's just continuity of government. The RCMP is still here. The banks are still here. The Liberals and the Conservatives still compete for power. There's not much has fundamentally changed in many ways.
Hello?
Yes? Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your great paper. Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
In a performance given in Athens last December on Asistegi by Caleb Brooks, it is suggested that the term Black indigeneity equates African Americans to neo-settler colonialists. My question is the following. How can the truly enslaved, the descendants of the truly enslaved, participate in settler colonialism while being targeted in a police state? And what is the identity of those who are both Black and indigenous?
Okay, thank you very much. I guess there's a couple of answers to that. One is that there are people who are Black and Indigenous. The Cherokee Freemen would be an example. And they would be indigenous peoples of the U.S. There's a term called arrivant, which is often used, like Braithwaite, I think, used the term in some of his poetry. So the descendants of enslaved African peoples that were brought to the Americas are often, in the literature, called arrivants and not settlers. So people that are here, not by some choice, but because of their enslavement. So if you look at the works of Métis author Chelsea Vowell, for example, and others writing in this, and I think of other people like Glenn Coulthard or Leanne Simpson, for example, will also talk of Black people not as being settlers. And so when Idle No More was quite active, and Black Lives Matter Toronto, they were forming close alliances with each other. There's a very good piece, kind of a forum that different members of Black Lives Matter do with members of Idle No More, and they discuss some of the commonalities, but also some of the differences between Black people and Indigenous people, trying to assert themselves for rights against settler colonialism. So I guess the answer would be that if you're writing on this topic, that the descendants of enslaved African peoples would generally be seen as arrivants. They would have a different status historically, maybe morally than settler colonial people. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, and
Thanks.
We will have to leave it there, and we will now take a 6-minute break before we get to Professor Walter's
Okay.
paper. Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you.